Lonely mountain man buys too wild giant girl, discovers she hunts bears with bare hands. That's the story folks will whisper in town. They'll say he bought trouble, big trouble, for a handful of coins. But what he really bought was a fight he never saw coming. She wasn't tamed by ropes or chains. She wasn't meant for saloons or shame. Out in the wild, where no lawman dares to follow, this girl's strength is more than muscle, it's survival. But when men with paper deeds and iron rails come to claim the land beneath their feet, the mountain man will have to decide, is she the burden everyone warned about? Or is she the only one who can save them all? When fists fail and guns run empty, who stands with the girl who hunts bears with bare hands? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The morning sun beat down harsh on the Bitterroot Gap auction block. A crowd of townsfolk gathered, their jeers cutting through the dry mountain air as Annaba stood tall despite her shackles. The half-Shoshone girl's dark eyes blazed with defiance, even as the auctioneer rattled off her supposed failings. "Too wild for honest work," he called out, gesturing at her torn dress and the welts on her arms. "Thrown out of Madame Rose's after less than a week. Who'll take this one off our hands?" Ezekiel Boone hung back in the crowd, his weathered face half hidden beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He hadn't meant to stop in town at all, but his trapline needed new wire. Now he found himself unable to look away from the proud young woman on the block. A commotion broke out near the front of the crowd. A small boy, no more than 6 or 7, stumbled against the saloon keeper's legs. The man's face twisted with anger as he raised his hand to strike. Before the blow could fall, Annaba moved with the speed of a mountain cat. Despite her chains, she lunged forward, placing herself between the child and the saloon keeper. "You will not touch him," she said, her voice low but firm as steel. The crowd fell silent. The saloon keeper's face turned purple with rage, but something in Annaba's steady gaze made him lower his hand. $8! The words burst from Ezekiel's mouth before he could stop them. He hadn't spoken so loud in months, not since, well, not for a long time. The auctioneer's relief was plain on his face. $8 going once, going twice, sold to the mountain man. As Ezekiel counted out the coins, he already regretted his impulse. What was he thinking? He'd lived alone since losing Sarah and the baby, and that's how he preferred it. But watching Annaba protect that child had stirred something in him, a sense of decency he'd thought long buried. The sheriff handed over the key to Annaba's shackles. When Ezekiel unlocked them, she rubbed her wrists but didn't run. She stood nearly as tall as him, watching with those sharp eyes that seemed to see right through him. "Listen here," Ezekiel said gruffly, keeping his voice low. "I'm heading up the mountain to my line shack. Once we're far enough out, I'll let you go where you please. No one will bother you up there." Annaba studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod. She fell into step beside him as they left town, ignoring the mutters and stares that followed them. They took the steep trail that wound up into the mountains. Storm clouds were gathering over the peaks, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. Ezekiel set a quick pace, hoping to make good distance before the weather turned. The girl kept up easily, moving with a natural grace that spoke of years in wild country. She didn't try to run, though there were plenty of chances. Maybe she knew that freedom in the mountains was better than what waited back in town. As dusk approached, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Ezekiel led them off the main trail and into a dense stand of pines. The thick branches would offer some shelter from the storm, and the location was hidden enough to be safe from any pursuit. "We'll make camp here," he said, shrugging off his pack. "No fire tonight, don't want to draw attention." Annaba nodded again, helping to lay out the bedrolls without being asked. The woods around them grew darker, filled with the rustling of branches and the distant cry of an owl. They shared a cold supper of jerky and hard biscuits in silence. Ezekiel took first watch, his rifle across his knees as he settled against a tree trunk. The girl curled up in her blanket, but he could tell by her breathing that she wasn't sleeping. They were both too aware of the darkness pressing in around them, of the unknown intentions they each carried. The storm clouds overhead finally broke, but the thick pine boughs caught most of the rain. Only occasional drops made it through, pattering softly on the needle-covered ground. In the darkness, Ezekiel wondered again what he'd gotten himself into. He'd meant to stay uninvolved, to keep to himself and his grief. But something about the girl's fierce protection of that child had wakened an old part of him, a part that still believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. Gray light filtered through the pines as Ezekiel and Annabah broke camp before dawn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp mountain morning that smelled of wet earth and pine sap. They ate a quick breakfast of cold biscuits, then shouldered their packs to continue the climb. The trail grew steeper as they ascended, winding through stands of lodgepole pine and around massive granite boulders. Ezekiel set a steady pace, noting how Annabah matched his stride without complaint. Her moccasins moved silent over the rocky ground, while his boots crunched on loose stones. As they approached a narrow ravine, something made the hair on Ezekiel's neck stand up. The birds had gone quiet. Too quiet. He reached for his rifle, but his fingers had barely brushed the stock when 800 pounds of grizzly bear exploded from behind a boulder. The massive creature rose up on its hind legs, towering over them both. Its hot breath filled the air with a rank smell as it bellowed, showing yellowed teeth. Ezekiel's hands shook as he tried to bring his rifle up, knowing he'd be too late. But Annabah didn't hesitate. She launched herself forward with a roar that matched the bear's own fury. Her dark hair flew wild as she met the creature head-on, wrestling with its massive form. She drove her shoulder into its chest, forcing it back a step. The grizzly swung one huge paw, but Annabah ducked and came up inside its reach. She grabbed handfuls of thick fur and planted her feet wide, screaming challenge into its face. The sound she made wasn't human. It was raw and primitive, a sound born of pure survival. Ezekiel stood frozen, rifle half raised, as woman and bear grappled on the rocky ground. Annabah never gave an inch, matching the grizzly's ferocity with her own. When the bear tried to bite, she slammed her fist into its sensitive nose. Blood ran from scratches on her arms, but she didn't seem to notice. Finally, the grizzly dropped to all fours and backed away, shaking its massive head. It studied them both with small, intelligent eyes, then turned and lumbered off into the undergrowth. The whole encounter had lasted less than a minute. Annabah stood breathing hard, her dress torn and bloody. She watched the bear disappear, then turned to check on Ezekiel. The look in her eyes was still wild, but there was something else there too, concern for his safety. "I reckon I owe you my life," Ezekiel said quietly. His hands were still trembling as he lowered his rifle. They continued their climb in silence, but something had shifted between them. Ezekiel found himself watching Annabah with new eyes, seeing past her savage reputation to the strength that kept her alive. The sun was setting when they finally reached Ezekiel's line shack. It was a modest structure of rough-hewn logs, with a small porch and a tin roof that gleamed dully in the fading light. A stack of split firewood leaned against one wall, and dried herbs hung from the porch rafters. "You can stay here tonight," Ezekiel offered, unlocking the door. "Least I can do after what happened back there." Inside, he lit a lantern that cast warm light over the simple furnishings. A plank table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner. Dried meat and beans hung from the rafters, and a collection of traps and tools lined one wall. Ezekiel dug out his medical supplies while Annabah built up the fire in the small stone hearth. When the flames were crackling, he gestured for her to sit at the table. "Let me see those hands." She held them out without protest. Her palms were scraped raw from wrestling with the bear, but she hadn't complained once during their long climb. Ezekiel cleaned the wounds carefully with whiskey and wrapped them in clean cloth. While he worked, Anaba picked up his torn sleeve where the bear's claws had caught it. Without a word, she found needle and thread in her own small bundle and began mending the tear with tiny, precise stitches. Her bandaged hands moved with surprising delicacy. They shared a simple supper of beans and salt pork with the last of the biscuits. The lantern light threw their shadows large against the log walls as they ate in comfortable silence. Ezekiel found himself studying Anaba's fierce features, seeing past her wild reputation to something deeper. What he'd first taken for reckless courage, he now recognized as pure survival instinct. This was someone who'd learned to fight for every scrap of life, who'd faced down worse than grizzly bears. The strength that made her too wild for town was the same strength that had saved his life today. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft gold as Ezekiel pulled on his boots. The floorboards creaked under his feet as he made his way to the door, pausing to grab his water bucket. The morning air bit cold and crisp against his face as he stepped outside. His path to the creek was well worn, winding between granite boulders and stands of aspen. But something felt wrong as he approached the familiar bend. The usual morning chorus of rushing water sounded thin, weakened. When he pushed through the willows to the creek bank, his heart sank. The creek had shrunk to half its normal width. Exposed rocks dotted the streambed where deep water should have run. He crouched down, running his fingers through the diminished flow. In all his years on the mountain, he'd never seen the water this low so early in the season. When he returned to the cabin, he found Anaba already awake. She knelt by the hearth, carefully feeding small sticks into the morning fire. The flames cast flickering light across her face as she looked up at his troubled expression. "Creek's running low," he said, setting down the half-full bucket. "Never seen it like this before." Anaba's hands stilled over the fire. "I know why," she said quietly. Her voice was rough from disuse. "Railroad men built dam upstream. 3 days' ride north." Ezekiel sat heavily in his chair. "That's reservation land up there." She nodded, her jaw tight. "They dry out hunting grounds. Many families suffer." She poked at the fire with more force than necessary. "I saw them build it. The foreman, he catch me watching. Say he kill me if I tell anyone." The implications settled heavy in Ezekiel's gut. He studied her across the small cabin space, this fierce young woman the town had labeled wild, who now sat hunted for knowing too much. "That why you ended up on that auction block?" "I run," she said simply. "They chase. I hide in town, but saloon keeper find me." Her hands clenched into fists. "Now, foreman, tell everyone I am fugitive. Say I steal from railroad camp." Ezekiel rubbed his beard, mind working. Sheltering her meant crossing the railroad men, the kind of powerful enemies a lone mountain man couldn't afford to make. But the thought of turning her out made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt since losing his family. "Well," he said finally, "fence needs mending. Might as well make yourself useful while you're here." They spent the morning replacing rotted fence posts along the eastern pasture. Ezekiel showed her how to test each post, marking the ones too far gone with a notch. Anaba proved strong with an axe, her strikes precise as she helped split new cedar posts. The work was steady and peaceful. Birds called from the forest edge as they dug holes and set posts. Anaba moved with quiet efficiency, needing few words to understand his gestures and nods. By midday, they'd replaced 8 posts and strung fresh wire between them. As they worked their way along the fence line, Ezekiel found himself watching the ridgeline more often than usual. Something about Anaba's story had him on edge, aware of how exposed they were on the mountainside. Late afternoon sun gilded the peaks when he spotted movement on the western ridge. A lone rider sat motionless against the sky, too far to make out clearly. Anaba was focused on securing a wire splice, unaware of their observer. But Ezekiel had survived too long in the mountains to ignore such signs. When they returned to the cabin, He made sure his Winchester rifle was loaded before setting it by the door. The weight of the weapon in his hands felt grimly familiar. Whatever trouble was coming, he meant to be ready. Twilight settled soft and purple over the mountain as they finished their evening meal. Anaba gathered the tin plates, humming quietly as she worked. The tune grew into a gentle song, words in her native tongue flowing like water over stones. Though he couldn't understand the meaning, the melody spoke of longing and home. Ezekiel recognized it as a lullaby, the kind sung to children at bedtime. He wondered if her mother had sung it to her, in some distant camp now dried out by the railroad's greed. The thought stirred something protective in his chest as he watched her silhouetted against the dying fire. Outside, night creatures began their evening chorus. Somewhere in the darkness, he knew, enemies waited. But for now, there was only the peaceful moment, the warm glow of the hearth, the soft Shoshone words floating on the evening air, and two unlikely allies finding brief sanctuary in each other's company. Morning light streamed through the cabin's single window as Ezekiel led Anaba to the chopping block. Frost sparkled on fallen leaves, and their breath formed clouds in the crisp air. He hefted his well-worn axe, its handle smooth from years of use. "Watch close now," he said, positioning a log on the block. "Ain't just about strength. Got to read the grain, find the natural splits." He demonstrated, the axe blade catching the wood just right. The log split clean down the middle with a satisfying crack. Anaba nodded, her dark eyes intent on his movements. When he handed her the axe, she gripped it with careful respect. Her first swing went wide, barely nicking the wood. But she didn't get frustrated, just adjusted her stance and tried again. "Like this?" she asked, mimicking his posture. "Better. Keep your feet planted solid." He tapped her boots with his toe, widening her stance. "Let the weight of the axe do the work." Her next swing struck true, the log splitting perfectly. A small smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen from her. They worked through the morning, building up a good pile of split wood. Ezekiel found himself impressed by how quickly she learned, how eager she was to master each detail. After their midday meal, Anaba led him to the edge of the clearing where fresh snow had fallen. She crouched down, pointing to marks in the white powder. "See here?" Deer passed before dawn. Mother and two young ones. Ezekiel knelt beside her, studying the tracks he would have missed. She showed him subtle differences in depth and spacing, teaching him to read the story written in the snow. Her knowledge ran deep, passed down through generations of her people. "Track tells many things," she explained. "How old, how fast, if animal is hurt or hungry." Her finger traced a faint impression. Like words on paper, but better. Nature's own writing. The afternoon light was growing long when they heard horses approaching. Ezekiel's hand went to his rifle as two men rode into view. Their clothes were too fine for mountain folk, railroad men by their look. The older one wore a gold watch chain across his vest. "Afternoon," the man with the watch said, touching his hat brim. "Name's Harrison from the railway company." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Word is you're harboring a fugitive, Indian girl wanted for theft." Ezekiel stepped forward, positioning himself between the men and the cabin where Anaba had disappeared inside. "Ain't harboring nobody. This here's my property." Harrison pulled a leather pouch from his saddlebag. Gold coins clinked inside as he tossed it toward Ezekiel. "Company's prepared to be generous. $500 in gold, just hand her over quiet-like." The pouch landed in the dirt at Ezekiel's feet. He didn't even glance at it. "Nothing here that belongs to you," he said evenly. "Best ride on." The second man's hand drifted toward his pistol, but Harrison held up a staying hand. "Think on it, friend. Company don't take kindly to folk interfering with its business." His tone hardened. "Be a shame if something happened to this nice place of yours." Ezekiel's grip tightened on his rifle. "Said all I mean to say." The men exchanged dark looks before turning their horses. "We'll be seeing you," Harrison called over his shoulder as they rode away. As dusk gathered, Ezekiel and Annabelle worked quickly to fortify the cabin. They strung tin cans between trees as warning bells, dug shallow pits disguised with branches, set snares along likely approach routes. Inside, they moved furniture to block the windows, keeping only narrow firing slots clear. Later, by lamplight, they sat at the rough-hewn table. Ezekiel cleaned his rifle while Annabelle mended a torn shirt. The familiar tasks filled the quiet space between them. "My Sarah," Ezekiel said suddenly, surprising himself by speaking of her. She loved this mountain, used to say the wind in the pines was singing to her. He ran a cloth down the rifle barrel. "Lost her, and our little one to fever 3 winters back." Annabelle's hand stilled on her sewing. "My father," she said softly, "he teach me everything about forest, about tracking. Railroad men shoot him when he try stop them building dam." Her voice caught. "Now I alone, like you?" Ezekiel looked up, meeting her eyes across the table. Understanding passed between them. 2 souls who knew the weight of empty spaces where family should be. He'd been alone so long, walling himself off from the world. But something about this fierce young woman had cracked that wall. "Not alone," he said gruffly. "Not anymore." Annabelle nodded, a ghost of that small smile touching her lips again. Outside, wind whispered through the pines, carrying the first hints of winter. But inside the cabin, lamplight held back the darkness, warming 2 hearts that had found unexpected sanctuary in each other's company. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in pale gold as Ezekiel and Annabelle prepared for their journey. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and fresh snow. Ezekiel stuffed dried meat and hard biscuits into his leather pack, while Annabelle filled 2 canteens from the weakened creek. "We follow deer trails," Annabelle whispered, shouldering her own pack. "They know safest paths through ravines." Ezekiel nodded, checking his rifle before slinging it across his back. They set out single file, Annabelle leading the way with her silent hunter's stride. The snow-laden branches drooped overhead, occasionally dropping soft clumps of white powder as they passed. The ravines grew steeper as they climbed, forcing them to pick their way carefully across icy rocks. Annabelle pointed out subtle signs as they traveled, rabbit tracks crossing their path, the marks of deer browsing on winter bare branches, a hawk's feather caught in low brush. "Animals tell us who watches," she explained, indicating how a group of tracks suddenly changed direction. "They sense danger before we do." Near midday, Annabelle held up her hand, dropping into a crouch. Ahead, through the trees, they caught their first glimpse of the railroad's handiwork. The dam sprawled across the creek bed like some terrible wooden giant, logs stacked and wedged against the canyon walls, forcing the water into large metal cisterns bearing the railroad's stamp. They crept closer, using a stand of young pines for cover. The dam's construction revealed its hasty nature. Support beams barely secured, gaps stuffed with canvas and pine boughs. Annabelle studied it with knowing eyes, her finger tracing paths in the air. "See there," she whispered, pointing to where the foundation met the creek bed. "Spring thaw will push hard against weak spots. Railroad men build quick, build wrong." Ezekiel frowned at the massive structure. "Reckon that's why they're so anxious to keep folk from seeing it. Won't last a season, way it's built." As they prepared to head back, Annabelle froze, her head tilted. Without a word, she changed direction, leading them up a narrow game trail. The path wound behind a rocky outcrop, ending at the mouth of a cave partially hidden by fallen timber. "Bear den," Ezekiel warned, but Annabelle shook her head. "Old den, empty now." She ducked inside, Ezekiel following reluctantly. The cave opened wider than expected, extending back into cool darkness. Annabelle moved surely, as if following a memory. "My father showed me this place when I was small. Sacred spring once flowed here." In the dim light filtering through the cave mouth, they found the spring, now choked with rocks and debris, but beneath the mess, they could hear the faint sound of running water. "We can clear it," Annaba said, already pulling away loose stones. "Water finds way, like hope finds way." They worked through the afternoon, hauling rocks and fallen branches, carefully rebuilding the spring's ancient channel. Ezekiel's hands grew raw from shifting stone, but he didn't stop. There was something right about this work, about helping this water find its path again. Finally, they cleared enough debris to see the result, a small but steady stream of clear water emerging from the cave's depths. Using branches and stone, they guided it toward a natural channel that would eventually feed Ezekiel's fields. "Not much," Ezekiel said, watching the thin stream catch the late afternoon light. "But it's something." Annaba dipped her fingers in the flowing water, then touched them to her forehead in what seemed like blessing. "Small stream can become river," she said softly. "Just needs time and place to flow." The journey back to the shack took them through deepening twilight. They moved carefully in the growing dark, following their earlier tracks. Both were bone-weary, but there was a lightness to their exhaustion, the satisfaction of work done right. Inside the shack, they ate a simple supper of jerky and the last of the morning's biscuits. The small stream they had freed could be heard even here, its gentle sound mixing with the night wind in the pines. Ezekiel banked the fire while Annaba spread their bedrolls, his near the hearth, hers by the far wall. The familiar routine felt different somehow, touched by the day's shared purpose. "Sleep now," Annaba said, settling into her blankets. "Water sings good dreams." Ezekiel lay down, listening to the soft trickle of their rescued spring, mingling with Annaba's steady breathing. Despite the day's labor, or perhaps because of it, he felt more at peace than he had in years. The sound of flowing water followed him into sleep, promising renewal, promising hope. Morning light streamed through the shack's single window as Ezekiel and Annaba gathered tools for their day's work. The mountain air held a hint of spring warmth, though patches of snow still dotted the ground. Ezekiel shouldered a shovel, while Annaba carried wooden planks and his old pickaxe. "Creekbed still remembers old ways," Annaba said, studying the lay of the land. She pointed to faint depressions in the earth, barely visible beneath winter-dead grass. "Water left marks. We follow these." Together they began digging shallow channels, following the natural contours of the land. Ezekiel marveled at Annaba's strength as she wielded the pickaxe, breaking through frozen ground with powerful, precise strikes. Her movements held the wisdom of generations who had worked with the land, rather than against it. "Like this," she demonstrated, angling a wooden plank to reinforce a bend in their makeshift canal. "Water needs gentle turn, not sharp corner. Flows better, stays longer." Ezekiel watched her work, realizing how much he had to learn. "Reckon you know more about water than most engineers I've met." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "My people lived with these springs for many seasons. Water teaches if you listen." By mid-morning, the first trickle of spring water reached Ezekiel's nearest field. They stood watching it seep into the thirsty soil when hoofbeats approached from the valley trail. Ezekiel tensed, but it was only old Widow Chen from the valley's only laundry, riding her familiar dappled mare. "Heard tell there's water flowing again," she said, dismounting carefully. Her eyes took in their work, then fixed knowingly on Annaba. "My well's been running low since that railroad crew moved in upstream." Ezekiel shifted uncomfortably, but Annaba met the widow's gaze steadily. After a moment, Widow Chen nodded. "Good work you're doing here, both of you." She remounted, then added quietly, "My boys are strong." "Good workers, if you need help." The offer hung in the air like a bridge between worlds. Throughout the day, more visitors appeared. Farmer Johnson and his wife, their wagon creaking up the trail. The Cooper sisters, who ran the general store. Even young Tom Wesley, whose family's apple orchard was withering from lack of water. Each came with careful words and knowing looks. Each departed leaving behind unspoken promises of support. As the sun began to set, Ezekiel and Annabah sat on the shack's porch, watching their small stream catch the fading light. The day's labor showed in their dirt-streaked faces and tired muscles, but satisfaction ran deeper than exhaustion. "Feels right," Ezekiel said softly. "Having folks stop by again? Been too long since this place heard friendly voices." Annabah nodded, understanding in her eyes. After a moment, she rose and went into the shack, returning with something wrapped in faded cloth. "Found this morning. Behind boxes." Ezekiel's breath caught as she unwrapped his wife's dulcimer. The simple wooden instrument gleamed in the last sunlight, its strings dusty but intact. His fingers trembled slightly as he took it. "Sarah loved this thing," he said roughly. "Used to play every evening after supper. Haven't touched it since." He trailed off, lost in memory. Annabah settled beside him, her presence steady and patient. Finally, Ezekiel positioned the dulcimer across his lap, brushing the strings gently. A soft chord hummed into the evening air. "This was her favorite hymn," he said, picking out a simple melody. "Amazing Grace. She taught it to all the neighborhood children." Annabah watched his fingers move across the strings, her head tilted in concentration. After several repetitions, she reached out hesitantly. "Show me." Ezekiel guided her hands to the proper positions, demonstrating the basic fingering. Annabah's strong hands, so sure with axe and shovel, touched the strings with surprising gentleness. Together they worked through the melody, one note at a time, while twilight deepened around them. The simple tune floated out across Ezekiel's fields, mixing with the sound of running water and evening bird song. As darkness settled over the mountain, more lights than usual twinkled in the valley below, each one representing a household that had visited that day, each one a potential ally against the railroad's greed. Inside the shack, they shared a simple supper of cornbread and beans. The dulcimer sat in its place of honor by the hearth, its presence filling the space with memories and new possibilities. Annabah hummed the hymn softly as she cleaned their dishes, the melody carrying traces of both its Christian origins and something older, something that belonged to her own people's songs. Ezekiel watched her move about the cabin, remembering how empty it had felt just days ago. Now it held something he'd thought lost forever, the warmth of family, however unexpected its form. The railroad's threats still loomed, but they no longer seemed as daunting. Like the spring they'd uncovered, hope had found a way to flow again. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft gold as Ezekiel and Annabah continued their work on the irrigation channels. The steady rhythm of their shovels broke the morning quiet, widening and deepening the trenches they'd started days before. Small victories emerged with each passing hour, water flowing stronger, reaching further across the parched earth. "Look here," Annabah called, pointing to tender green shoots pushing through the soil near one of the first channels they'd dug. Wild onions, dormant through years of drought, had sensed the water's return. Ezekiel touched the delicate sprouts, hope rising in his chest like spring sap in the pines. They worked through that day and the next, their efforts rewarded by subtle changes across the homestead. The chicken's water trough stayed full now, and the tired old mare lifted her head with new energy when Ezekiel filled her bucket. Even the wind seemed to carry more life, rustling through grass that stood a shade greener than before. By the second evening, Annabah had rigged clever wooden gates to control the water's flow, using smooth river stones as counterweights. "Like fish traps," she explained, demonstrating how to adjust them. "Water goes where needed, when needed." Ezekiel nodded, impressed by her ingenuity. The simple system would help them manage their precious resource through the dry months ahead. The third morning broke clear and cold. Ezekiel was checking the nearest channel when he heard approaching hoofbeats. Young Billy Matthews, the town clerk's son, rode up on his father's bay gelding, face flushed from hard riding. "Mr. Boone!" The boy pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "Pa said to bring this straight away. Said it's urgent." Ezekiel took the telegram, his weathered hands careful with the thin paper. As he read, his jaw tightened. The message was brief but clear. The railroad had hired guns, mean ones, headed toward Bitterroot Gap to resolve the water dispute permanently. "Much obliged, Billy," Ezekiel said, pressing a coin into the boy's hand. "Tell your pa I'm grateful for the warning." After Billy rode off, Ezekiel found Annabeth by the spring outflow, where she was clearing debris from the channel. Her eyes narrowed at his expression. "Trouble?" "Railroad's done talking." He handed her the telegram. "They're sending men to end this, their way." Annabeth read the message slowly, her finger tracing each word. When she looked up, her face held the same fierce determination he'd seen when she faced down the grizzly. "Then we must end it our way first." Inside the cabin, they spread out Ezekiel's old map of the territory on the rough-hewn table. Annabeth weighted the corners with stones, then took a stub of charcoal and began marking locations. "Dam here," she said, making a bold X. "Guard posts here and here." Her hand moved surely across the paper, marking trails and camps. "But they don't know all paths. My people used hidden ways before railroad came." Ezekiel studied the route she sketched, a narrow line threading through steep ravines and ancient game trails. "Reckon we could get close enough to document their operation? Territorial judge might listen if we bring proof." Annabeth nodded. "I know place, high cliff above dam, can see everything, take pictures?" She hesitated. "But railroad men watch main trails. Getting there." She traced the secret path again. "Show me," Ezekiel said. Through the fading daylight, they planned their approach. Ezekiel had an old camera, carefully preserved from his surveying days. Annabeth knew exactly where they needed to position themselves to capture the illegal dam and water theft in one clear shot. But timing would be crucial. "Guards change at dawn," Annabeth explained, drawing patterns of the railroad men's movements in the dirt floor. "Tired from night watch, less careful. Best time to slip past." Ezekiel checked his camera, making sure the mechanisms still worked smooth and quiet. Pictures won't mean much without official documents showing they never got permission to dam the creek. He pulled out a worn leather folder. "Been keeping records since they first showed up. Dates, times, water levels, even got signatures from folks downstream whose wells dried up." Annabeth's eyes brightened with understanding. Evidence for judge. Proof on paper. Proof in pictures. "Territorial Judge Crawford's a fair man," Ezekiel said, organizing his documents. "Known him 20 years. He won't take kindly to railroad men stealing water from legal homesteads and reservation land alike." They worked late into the evening, Annabeth drawing a detailed map of the hidden route, while Ezekiel prepared his camera and papers. The lamp burned low as they finalized their plan. They would leave before first light, following Annabeth's secret trail to the overlook. With luck and skill, they'd have the evidence in hand before the railroad's hired guns arrived. "One thing more," Annabeth said, rolling up her map carefully. She picked up a piece of charcoal and began sketching on a fresh paper. Her sure strokes captured every detail of the dam's construction, the weak points in its foundation, the illegal sluice gates, the diverted water flow. "If Judge needs more than pictures," she explained, "this shows how they built it wrong, against water's nature." Ezekiel studied her drawing, recognizing the expertise behind every line. Together they had assembled a strong case. Now they just needed to deliver it safely to Judge Crawford before the railroad's men arrived to silence them permanently. Under a moonless sky, Ezekiel and Annabeth crept through the pine-shadowed valley. Their boots made no sound on the damp earth as they approached the railroad's dam. Ezekiel carried his old surveyor's tools wrapped in cloth, while Annaba clutched precious sheets of drawing paper against her chest. The massive wooden structure loomed before them, its dark silhouette blocking the stars. Water trickled weakly around its edges, a fraction of the creek's natural flow. Annaba touched Ezekiel's arm and pointed to the lowest support beam. "I can climb it," she whispered. "The measurements must be exact." Ezekiel handed her the measuring tape and pencil. His heart hammered as she began scaling the dam's framework, her movements as sure as a mountain cat's. The wooden beams creaked softly under her weight. From his position below, Ezekiel sketched the dam's overall shape, marking where it diverted the water. He noted how the structure extended beyond the railroad's legal property line, encroaching on both reservation and homestead lands. Dawn's first gray light touched the eastern sky as Annaba descended, her papers filled with detailed drawings. She'd documented every illegal modification, every overflow pipe that robbed the creek of its natural course. "We have what we need," Ezekiel said, carefully rolling their evidence into a leather tube. They hurried home through the growing light, taking Annaba's hidden trail. As they approached the shack, Ezekiel's steps faltered. Something was wrong. The door stood slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered latching it. Annaba noticed too, her body tensing. Ezekiel drew his rifle and approached cautiously. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed at first glance. Their breakfast dishes still sat unwashed on the table. The bed blankets remained rumpled exactly as they'd left them. But someone had been there. Ezekiel could smell tobacco smoke lingering in the air, a brand he didn't use. Their intruder had left everything untouched, deliberately so. The message was clear. "We can reach you whenever we want." "We'll sleep in shifts tonight," Ezekiel said, securing the door and windows. "You first, I'll keep watch." Annaba nodded, settling onto her pallet with her rifle across her lap. Outside, a whip-poor will called into the gathering dusk. Ezekiel sat by the window, his gun ready, watching shadows deepen across the yard. Neither of them spoke of what tomorrow might bring. Dawn broke cold and clear over Ezekiel's homestead. He wrapped the precious dam evidence in oilcloth, then handed it to Thomas Wheeler, a neighboring widower who'd offered his help. The old man tucked the package inside his coat. "Ride hard for Judge Morrison and Helena," Ezekiel instructed, gripping Wheeler's stirrup. "Don't stop for nothing or nobody." Wheeler nodded grimly and spurred his horse down the mountain trail. Ezekiel watched until rider and mount disappeared into the pines before turning back to their preparations. Annaba worked steadily, reinforcing the shack's shutters with strips of iron they'd salvaged from broken tools. Ezekiel dug more defensive trenches, laying sharpened stakes at angles that would snag charging horses. By midday, dark smoke began rising from the valley below. Ezekiel counted 3 separate columns twisting into the sky. Through his spyglass, he watched farmhouses burning, homes of those who'd spoken against the railroad's dam. "They're coming up the mountain next," Annaba said quietly, testing the tension on a tripwire. The sun was setting when they heard horses approaching. Ezekiel counted at least 8 riders by the sound of their hooves. He and Annaba took their positions, him behind the woodpile, her in the root cellar with a clear shot at the yard. The first rider triggered their warning bells. Shots rang out from the darkness. Ezekiel returned fire, hearing a cry as one of the railroad men fell. But there were too many. They circled the homestead like wolves, torches blazing. A bottle crashed through the shack's window, spreading liquid fire across the floor. Smoke began pouring from the roof as more flames took hold. "Annaba, run!" Ezekiel shouted. They fled through their prepared escape route, a narrow gap in the back fence leading into thick brush. Behind them, the shack crackled and roared as fire consumed it. From the safety of the forest's edge, they watched everything burn. The humble shack, the woodpile, the fences they'd mended together. The railroad men's torches moved like angry fireflies through the darkness, searching. Ezekiel felt Annaba's hand grip his arm, as his home disappeared into flames. All their work, all their planning reduced to ash. But they were alive, and they were together. The cave's damp chill seeped through their clothes as Ezekiel and Annaba huddled near its mouth. Moonlight cast long shadows across the limestone floor. Neither had slept, their minds racing with the night's events. "The dam," Annaba said suddenly, breaking their long silence. "I can destroy it." Ezekiel turned to her, his weathered face creased with concern. "Too dangerous. Those men mean to kill you." "They mean to kill us all slowly anyway," Annaba replied, her voice steady. "Without water, the farms die. Without farms, the town dies." She traced a pattern in the dirt with a stick, sketching the dam's structure. "I know where it's weakest. One person could do it." "No." Ezekiel's voice cracked. "I won't lose." He stopped himself, but Annaba understood. After losing his wife, the thought of losing her too was unbearable. "You taught me about standing up for what's right," she said softly. "Let me stand." As dawn's first light crept into the cave, they formed their plan. Ezekiel would return to town while Annaba prepared for her assault on the dam. She began gathering vines and crafting tools from fallen branches, her movements precise and determined. Ezekiel made his way down the mountain, keeping to the shadows. In town, he found Sarah Miller's kitchen door unlocked. The widow had always been kind to him. Inside, he found not just Sarah, but 5 other townspeople gathered around her table, including Pastor Matthews. "The railroad burned us out," Ezekiel said simply. "We saw the flames," Sarah replied, pouring him coffee with trembling hands. "They burned out the Hendersons too, and the Wilsons." Pastor Matthews leaned forward, his usual gentle demeanor hardened by anger. "They've gone too far. This isn't progress, it's tyranny." One by one, the others spoke up. Farmers who'd lost crops to the drought, widows whose wells had run dry. They'd all suffered under the railroad's greed. "There might be a way," Ezekiel said carefully, "to destroy the dam, let the water flow again." The pastor's eyes met his. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," he said firmly. "If that dam were to fall, you'd find no shortage of friends here." They nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. Ezekiel felt hope stirring for the first time since the flames had taken his home. "When it happens," Sarah added, squeezing his hand, "we'll be ready to stand with you." Dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of amber as Annaba crept through the underbrush toward the dam. Her moccasins made no sound on the damp earth. Years of working as a servant had taught her to move like a shadow, and now those skills served a greater purpose. The massive wooden structure loomed before her, creaking under the weight of diverted water. Annaba's keen eyes traced the support beams, identifying the weak points she'd noted during their earlier reconnaissance. The railroad men had built it hastily, more concerned with speed than safety. She waited, watching the 2 drowsy guards pass each other on their morning patrol. When they reached opposite ends of their route, Annaba slipped from her hiding place and scaled the nearest support beam. The rough wood scraped her palms, but she ignored the pain. She'd endured worse. Reaching the first weak joint, Annaba braced herself and began working the support beam loose. Her muscles strained as she twisted the poorly secured timber. A lifetime of heavy labor had made her strong, and now that strength would serve justice. The beam groaned. Below, one of the guards paused, cocking his head. Annaba held perfectly still, barely breathing. After a long moment, he moved on. She resumed her work, feeling the joint weaken. With a muffled crack, it gave way. The entire structure shuddered slightly. "Hey!" a shout rang out. One of the guards had spotted her. Annaba didn't hesitate. She swung to another beam as bullets splintered the wood where she'd been. The dam's groaning grew louder as she scrambled higher, targeting the next weak point. Down in Bitterroot Gap, Ezekiel led a group of townspeople toward the railroad office. Sarah Miller and Pastor Matthews walked beside him, followed by farmers with pitchforks and widows with rolling pins. Their faces were grim but determined. The railroad's enforcers emerged from the saloon, hands hovering near their guns. The foreman sneered. "Clear the street, folks. This ain't your concern." "It became our concern when you stole our water," Pastor Matthews said firmly, "when you burned out honest farmers." More townspeople emerged from doorways and alleyways, swelling their numbers. The enforcers glanced nervously at each other, realizing they were outnumbered. Back at the dam, Anaba had reached the crucial support. Bullets whizzed past her as more guards arrived, but the unstable structure worked in her favor. They couldn't get a clear shot without risking their own footing. She wrapped her legs around a beam and hung upside down, pounding at the joint with a rock. The whole dam shuddered ominously. Water began spraying through widening cracks. "She's gonna bring it down!" one guard shouted. "Get back!" In town, the standoff continued. The railroad foreman raised his pistol, but Sarah Miller stepped forward, brandishing her rolling pin. "You shoot one of us, you'll have to shoot us all. And then you'll have no one left to build your precious railroad," another widow added. A thunderous crack echoed from the mountain. Everyone turned to look. Anaba delivered one final blow to the weakened support. The beam splintered, and with it went the dam's last hope of stability. She leaped clear as the massive structure began to collapse. The sound was deafening. Timber snapped like twigs. The imprisoned water burst free with explosive force, reclaiming its ancient path. Anaba landed hard on the bank and rolled away as debris rained down. When the dust settled, she stood tall amid the wreckage. Water rushed past her, returning to its rightful course. The guards had fled, leaving her alone with her victory. The roar of released water reached the town. People ran to watch as the creek bed filled again, the life-giving flow returning to their parched valley. Children splashed in puddles while their parents wept with joy. The railroad men found themselves surrounded by celebrating townspeople. Their power, like their dam, had crumbled. Anaba walked into town as the sun reached its peak. Her clothes were torn and muddy, her hands scraped raw, but her head was held high. The crowd parted to let her through, their faces filled with awe and gratitude. Ezekiel met her in the middle of the street. His eyes shone with pride as he looked at the young woman who had become like a daughter to him. She had taken all the strength that others had feared and used it to save them all. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," Anaba replied, gesturing to the townspeople. "All of us together." Water flowed through Bitterroot Gap once more, bringing with it the promise of renewal. The railroad's dam was gone, and with it, their chokehold on the valley. And Anaba, once branded as too wild, had become a legend. Not for her untamed spirit, but for the justice it helped her deliver. The water thundered down the mountainside, reclaiming its ancient paths. Small creeks that had been reduced to dusty ditches filled with fresh, cold mountain water. The dry fields surrounding Bitterroot Gap drank deeply as the life-giving flow spread through the valley. The railroad enforcers stumbled back into town, their clothes dripping and their dignity washed away. They looked nothing like the intimidating men who had terrorized the valley just days before. Several of them nursed bruises from their hasty retreat from the collapsing dam. Ezekiel stood at the head of a group of townspeople in front of the railway office. His weathered face showed no satisfaction at the enforcers' miserable state, only stern determination. Sarah Miller and Pastor Matthews flanked him, backed by farmers and shopkeepers who had found their courage. "Your dam is gone," Ezekiel said simply to the railway foreman, "and your hold over this valley with it." The foreman's face twisted with rage. "You'll all pay for this. The railroad doesn't forget." The telegraph operator burst from his office, waving a yellow paper. "Message from Judge Harrison," he called out, pushing through the crowd. His hands trembled as he read the telegram aloud. based on evidence received regarding illegal water rights violations and intimidation of citizens. Federal investigation ordered into Bitterroot Railway operations. All construction halted pending review. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The foreman's face drained of color as he snatched the telegram, reading it himself. His hands crumpled the paper. "You sent evidence to the judge?" he snarled at Ezekiel. "While you were burning my home," Ezekiel replied evenly. "Seems you were so busy watching for trouble from the front, you missed it riding out the back door." The foreman looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him. His enforcers shifted uneasily, no longer certain of their position. Without a word, he stormed into the railway office. Within an hour, he was seen riding hard out of town, saddlebags stuffed with railway documents. As afternoon faded into evening, the church bells rang out. Townspeople emerged from their homes, carrying covered dishes and lanterns. They congregated in the whitewashed church, filling the pews and spilling out onto the steps. The air hummed with excitement and relief. Pastor Matthews stood at the pulpit, his kind face beaming. "Today, we witnessed a miracle," he began. "Not just the return of our water, but the triumph of courage over tyranny, of community over greed." Ezekiel sat in the back pew, uncomfortable with crowds but unwilling to miss this moment. Beside him, Annaba perched stiffly, her eyes wide. She had changed into a clean dress borrowed from Sarah Miller, though she kept her moccasins. Her hands, still raw from the morning's work, lay folded in her lap. "We owe our deliverance to two people," the pastor continued. "To Ezekiel Boone, who chose mercy when others showed none, who stood firm when others would have yielded." He gestured to Ezekiel, who ducked his head at the attention. "And to Annaba," Pastor Matthews said, his voice warming, "who some called wild, but who showed us that strength guided by justice is no curse, but a blessing." Annaba sat perfectly still as every head turned toward her. She had known only scorn from crowds before, but now she saw something different in their faces: respect, gratitude, even admiration. Sarah Miller stood up. "My fields were dying last week. Today they drink deep. My children were thirsty. Today they splash in clean water. We judged you wrongly, Annaba, and we're grateful you judged us better than we deserved." "Here, here," several voices called out. More people stood, sharing stories of parched gardens now promising harvest, of livestock finally having clean water, of the railroad's oppression finally broken. Widow Jenkins hobbled forward with a quilted blanket in her arms. "We made this today," she said, presenting it to Annaba. "Every family contributed a square, so you'll always know you have a home here." Annaba's fingers trembled as she touched the colorful squares. Each one told a story: a farmhouse, a flowing creek, a stand of pine trees, a rising sun. In the center was a bear, strong and proud, protecting a valley of tiny houses. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion. Then, louder, in the clear voice she had found destroying the dam, "Thank you all." Ezekiel watched as the townspeople crowded around Annaba, offering food and friendship. The girl who had arrived in chains now sat wrapped in a quilt of belonging, accepting slices of pie and warm handshakes. Her wild spirit hadn't been tamed. It had been recognized for the gift it was, a force for justice that had saved them all. The church buzzed with conversation and laughter long into the evening. Children played tag in the aisles while their parents shared dishes and stories. The water flowed strong and clear through the valley, and with it flowed hope for a new chapter in Bitterroot Gap's history. The morning after the celebration, Ezekiel and Annaba stood amid the charred remains of his line shack. The blackened timbers told a story of destruction, but the fresh mountain breeze carried promise. Already, neighbors were arriving with tools and determination. "Ain't right what they did to your place, Ezekiel," Tom Henderson called out, leading a small wagon train of supplies. The carpenter's weathered hands gripped his toolbox as he surveyed the damage. "My Sarah, God rest her soul, always said a man's home is sacred ground. Throughout the morning, more townspeople arrived. Women brought baskets of bread and dried meat. Children carried water from the newly flowing creek. Men hefted lumber and hammers. The sound of work filled the mountain air, saws buzzing, hammers pounding, voices calling encouragement. Tom pulled Ezekiel aside as others cleared debris. "Got something to show you?" he said, unrolling blueprints on a flat rock. "Been keeping these houseplans since Sarah passed. Never could bear to build it elsewhere. Reckon you and the girl could put it to good use." Ezekiel studied the simple but solid design. "Tom, this is too much." "Nonsense," Tom replied gruffly, hiding emotion behind his beard. "Way I see it, you two saved more than just our water. You showed us what community means again. Sarah would have wanted this." By midday, the foundation was marked and post holes were being dug. Annaba worked alongside everyone, her strength earning admiring glances from the men. But it was her gentle patience with the curious children that drew the most attention. "Miss Annaba," little Jenny Miller called out, holding up a strange track in the mud. "What made this?" Annaba knelt beside the girl, other children gathering around. "See how the toes spread wide?" she explained, tracing the impression. "That's a raccoon. He came to drink from the creek last night." "How do you know it was night?" Tommy Jenkins asked. "The mud was soft then from evening dew. And see these smaller tracks alongside? Those are his babies, learning to fish." The children listened, entranced, as Annaba taught them to read the stories written in soil and bark. She showed them which plants could heal bee stings, which berries were safe to eat, how to walk quietly through the woods. Parents paused in their work, watching their children absorb lessons of respect for the land. As days passed, the new house took shape. It was smaller than the old line shack, but sturdier, with 2 proper rooms and a covered porch facing the creek. The whole valley seemed to be healing, green shoots pushing through burnt earth, water bringing life back to parched fields. One afternoon, while Annaba was showing the children how to weave baskets from creek reeds, a rider approached from town. He carried an official-looking envelope. "Letter from Miss Annaba," he announced, "from the Territorial Indian Agency." Ezekiel tensed, but Annaba calmly opened the letter. Her eyes widened as she read. "They want my help," she said softly, "to mediate water rights between the railroad, settlers, and my mother's people. They say my knowledge of both worlds could help prevent future conflicts." Ezekiel studied her face. "What do you think about that?" "I think." Annaba looked at the children still weaving beside her, at the flowing creek, at their half-built home. "I think this is where I'm meant to be, helping build bridges, not just between water and land, but between peoples." That evening, as purple shadows crept across the valley, Ezekiel and Annaba sat on their new porch steps. The wood was fresh cut, still fragrant with pine sap. Cricket song rose from the creek banks where Annaba had taught the children to listen for night creatures. "Never thought I'd have family again," Ezekiel said quietly, watching the first stars appear. After losing Martha and the baby, seemed easier to just be alone. Annaba nodded, understanding in her silence. She pulled a small object from her pocket, a carved wooden bear, worn smooth with age. "My father made this," she said. "Said a bear knows when to fight and when to build a den, when to be fierce and when to nurture. I didn't understand then." She placed the carving on the porch rail. "But I do now." They sat together, this unlikely father and daughter, as evening settled over their new home. The creek murmured below, its voice strong and sure once more. Tomorrow would bring more building, more teaching, more healing of the land and its people. But for now, they rested in the quiet knowledge that sometimes family isn't born. It's built, like a house, one careful piece at a time. Weeks passed, and summer settled fully into the valley. The new house stood proud against the mountain backdrop, its fresh-cut timber weathering to a gentle gray. Morning light caught the dew on Ezekiel's expanding garden, where rows of corn reached toward the sky and bean vines climbed sturdy poles. Ezekiel paused in his morning chores, drawn by the sound of young voices carrying across the meadow. There, beneath the spreading branches of an old cottonwood, Annabah knelt in the grass, surrounded by 8 children. Their small faces, some sun-browned, some copper-dark, focused intently on her hands as she traced marks in the soil. From his vantage point by the garden fence, Ezekiel watched as Annabah guided little Sarah Running Deer's fingers along a shallow impression in the earth. The Shoshone girl's dark braids mingled with Jenny Miller's blonde ones as they bent together over the track. "Feel how deep the print is here." Annabah's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "The deer passed through at dawn, when the ground was still soft with dew." Tommy Jenkins, once the most troublesome boy in town, raised his hand eagerly. "But how do you know it was just this morning, Miss Annabah?" "Look at the edges," she replied, gesturing for all the children to gather closer. "See how sharp they are? If this track was older, rain or wind would have softened the lines." Ezekiel's weathered hands rested on the fence post as he observed the lesson. His chest tightened with an emotion he hadn't expected. Pride, yes, but something deeper, too. Something that felt like hope. The children followed Annabah like ducklings as she led them along the creek bank, pointing out more signs of the morning's wildlife parade. She stopped at a mud bank, where tiny paw prints crossed the larger tracks they'd been following. "Who can tell me what passed here?" she asked. "Raccoon!" several voices called out together. "That's right," Annabah smiled. "And what was the raccoon doing?" Young William White Cloud, grandson of the Shoshone chief, spoke up shyly. "Fishing? The tracks lead to the water and back." "Very good," Annabah praised. "The land tells stories if we learn to listen." As if to demonstrate, she settled cross-legged on the ground, motioning for the children to do the same. "Close your eyes," she instructed. "Feel the earth beneath you. Listen." Ezekiel watched in amazement as 8 fidgety children grew still, their faces peaceful in concentration. A meadowlark's song floated across the grass. The creek chuckled over stones. A gentle breeze stirred the cottonwood's leaves. "The earth speaks in many voices," Annabah said softly, "in bird song and water music, in the whisper of leaves and the stories in the soil. Our ancestors, all our ancestors, knew how to listen." The scene before him blurred slightly, and Ezekiel blinked away unexpected moisture. He remembered the day he'd first seen Annabah on that auction block, fierce and untamed. Now here she stood, teaching the next generation to bridge the gaps between their peoples, between humanity and the land itself. Down in town, he knew, attitudes had shifted like spring ice breaking up. He'd heard Martha Henderson at the general store just yesterday, telling a newcomer about our Annabah, the girl who fights bears with her bare hands. The pride in her voice had been unmistakable. Even crusty old Samuel Johnson, who'd once muttered darkly about wild Indians, now tipped his hat respectfully when Annabah passed. The children's lesson continued as morning lengthened toward noon. Annabah showed them how to identify healing plants, which berries were safe to eat, how to walk quietly through the woods. When young Tommy discovered a fresh track, his excited whoop brought smiles to everyone's faces. Miss Annabah, come see what I found!" She knelt beside the boy, her long black braid falling forward as she examined his discovery. "Very good, Tommy. What do you hear the earth telling you about this track?" The boy closed his eyes just as she had taught them, placing one small hand on the ground beside the print. His face screwed up in concentration, then relaxed into a smile. "The earth feels cool here, in the shadow," he said slowly, "and I can hear the creek singing. And—" his eyes opened wide with revelation. "The track feels fresh, like it was just made." Annabah's laugh joined the boy's proud giggle, the sounds mixing with the creek's music in a melody that made Ezekiel's heart feel full to bursting. This was what decency looked like, he realized. Not grand gestures or loud proclamations, but small seeds planted in fertile soil, growing quiet and strong in the hearts of children. The lesson drew to a close as the sun climbed higher. Parents would be expecting their children home for the midday meal. But as Ezekiel watched Anaba leading her small band back toward town, he saw the future taking shape before his eyes. These children would grow up knowing the truth that had taken him so long to learn. That family, like the earth itself, knew no boundaries of blood or race. It grew wherever it was tenderly planted and carefully tended. The last sounds he heard were Tommy's excited voice asking another question about tracking, and Anaba's gentle answer floating back on the breeze, mixed with the eternal song of the flowing creek. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.